So hi everyone. So thanks to be here. So I would say, as we are very few, if you have any question, do not hesitate to interrupt me and ask any question during the presentation. So I'm going to talk today about personalized shift scheduling problems, from modeling to efficient resolution. So it's some work that I've started 10 years ago, and we built several layers on top of each other for building this solver. And so several people have been involved since the beginning in this project. So first, I will have a brief introduction about personalized shift scheduling, and more precisely nurse scheduling, which is often the main example for them. The different methodologies that we have built, and acceleration techniques that we have implemented to be able to solve those problems, and plenty of experience. So if I might say, the time is perfect because so what I will present today, I've just been accepted in a paper from Journal of Computing 10 days ago, I think. So perfect time. So personalized shift-based schedule. The idea, you have main features, you can add many things to that, but you have a planning horizon and you want to plan a schedule for some employee over those plans. You have a set of shifts. So the idea here is you are not creating shifts, the shifts are given. So for example, you work the morning, during the day, the evening, or during the night, but you don't have to choose when do you start or when do you finish your shift. The shift is given and you are just assigned or not to a given shift. You have generally a demand for each shift and each day. And an employee can be generally assigned to a maximum of one shift a day. You have also plenty of what I call ergonomic constraints. So to ensure that the schedule is nice for the employee. It's where the problem starts to be tough, but because you can have, I don't know, 20 of them for each employee and so on. So it starts to be a lot of constraint to maintain and to count and ensure for each employee. And on top of that, you have also employee preferences that you have. The software and so I'm talking about employee, but generally it's nurses. But you can use that also in some other industry. So here, for example, just a quick look to what could be a schedule. So generally, you have here in orange part, it's what I call the history. So it's the shift that you have done in the previous days before the planning period. So the idea is you're gonna plan for example, 4 to 8 weeks. And after that, you start, and I don't know, 3 weeks before the beginning of the next schedule, you start to plan it and so on. And because you have generally constraints about transitions between shifts from one day to the other, or constraints on the number of consecutive shifts or consecutive work days that you have, you need to take into account this history to be sure that at the border, you're okay and you're still producing nice schedules for the employee. And then you can you just illustrate the shift for each of them. What we have also here is you can have skills. So you can have a demand per shift, but also per skill, saying, oh, for this given care unit, today for the day shift, I want to have 1 head nurse and 3 nurses inside the care unit. And so you have to assign which nurse is going to be the head nurse. Some of the nurses can be a head nurse, some other cannot. So you have also to manage those skills. And for sure, then you have plenty of preferences. So because of the preferences and the history, that's why we are talking about personalized. As you can see, all the nurses will have different histories. So to be able to manage those borders effect, you need to look at each schedule for each nurse. And you cannot just look at general schedules without taking into account those histories. So classical column generation problems handle hard constraints generally. Here we have a lot of soft constraint generally, because all the ergonomic constraints, or most of them, or the preferences are soft constraints. So you can violate those constraints, but you pay a penalty, but they are not forbidden. And so most of the tool that has been developed, for example, for vehicle routing problem, most of those constraints there are hard. So we're talking about time window, capacity, or things like that. And normally you cannot exceed the bound that you have. And so we have built a dedicated approach for those constraints and how to handle soft constraints. There are several benchmarks in the literature. So INRC, which is an International Nurse Rostering Competition, You have the NRC 2, which is an internal nurse rostering competition 2. So it's where the work has started for us because we participate to this competition and we ranked in the second place. The specific aspect of the NRC 2, it was a dynamic scheduling. So you were planning week by week. And for the other one, they are deterministic. So you have the demand for the whole planning horizon and you plan over it. And so for this one here, what I will present is we just took the whole static instance. So instead of planning week by week, we take all the week and we plan at once for exactly the same way than for the other. So it just creates new instances. And you have the last one, which is also some instances. So the difference is also you have different set of constraints and so on for all those instances. So classically, that's the type of things that you will have in a rostering problem. So that's, for example, for NRC2, you have a set of nurses that go from 30 nurses to 120 nurses. You have a planning horizon, 4 to 8 weeks. For example, here you have skills, so head nurse, caretaker, intern, and you can add some others. And the basic way to define those problems is you have contracts. So contracts will give you all the type of constraints that you have to ensure for each employee. So it goes from hard constraints to soft constraints that are more about the demand, and some other more about collective agreements also that you have to respect, and some other are just ergonomic constraints just to ensure that you're producing good results and schedules for those nurses. And then what you have in input is the work shift, so what type of shift you will have, the history, so the sequence of shift that has been worked before the beginning of the planning horizon, some preferences, so day off, day on, shift off on every day, and hard or soft constraints, and a demand. So here the demand is per day, per shift, and per skill. So, and then you have plenty of constraints, many constraints. So I'm just giving a few. Number of consecutive shifts. So for example, I'm saying, oh, I want to work between 3 and 5 consecutive work shifts. If I'm working night, I want to do at least 3 nights consecutive. I don't want to do just 1 night, and things like that you can put in it. Total number of assignments. So if you look over a 4 weeks period and you have in your full time, perhaps you would say, oh, I want to work at least 12 or 14 days and maximum 22 days. And so you're managing the number of assignments that you get. You want to manage also the number of total work weekend. So ideally on the 4 week for full time, you want to have 2 weekends off and 2 weekends where you work. So you are managing also those type of constraints. Then you have more complex constraints about some patterns. So for example, you want to avoid patterns that are bad for the nurses. So we'll see some example, but ideally, for example, if you do a shift in the morning, on the first day, the next day you do a shift on the evening, perhaps you have the right after an evening shift to do another morning shift. It's not forbidden, but you don't want to give that to an employee to do morning, evening, morning. You have a very short night and it's tough. So for example, you want to forbid or at least penalize these types of patterns. You can also have constraints about the complete weekend. So either you work or you rest, but you don't want to work only 1 day on the weekend, and so on. So you build, so why is it tough? You build personalized schedule. So if we look at that from a column generation point of view, because it's what we use as a technique behind the scene, it means that you have one subproblem per nurse. You cannot have one subproblem for several nurses, and so having less subproblem to solve in the column generation. Because of the preferences, because of the history, solution or some schedules could be feasible for some nurses, not feasible for some other because of the preferences of the history. And the same, the cost will not be the same. And a good schedule for a nurse is not perhaps a good schedule for another nurse. And so you really need to handle each nurse separately. And so having one subproblem for each nurse. So if you have up to 150 nurses, it means you have 150 subproblems to solve in your column generation. And it's on a long horizon. So producing those schedules, when you solve them, the subproblem over 8 weeks, can start to take a lot of time. We're talking about 56 days. So it's very long path in the subproblems. And so that's why the classical resource constraint shortest path problem takes time. You have many soft constraints with lower and upper bound. So as we will see, you cannot really do any domination on that, or the classical domination that you use, because when you want to dominate on lower and upper bounds, you can only dominate if you have the same value. As you have many constraints, it means that you will have many resources, so only the resources, the partial paths, as we will see, that consume exactly the same amount of resources can be compared. So it's really bad in terms of domination.
This long horizon, is this something common in this type of industry to do that for 2 months ahead?
2 months, perhaps not, but 1 month is very common. The 4 weeks is really the basic. Because people want, because as you can work the weekend, work the day, and your, I would say, schedule can change a lot from one day to the next, or 1 month to the next. You want to be able to organize your personal life. And so just telling you today that you're gonna work this weekend doesn't work. We have already a nurse shortage in Quebec, so with if you start to not give them a planning in advance, you can be sure that this nurse is gonna work in some other hospital that provide them better planning and better conditions. So it's important to produce good schedule. And I would say some hospitals are doing only 2 weeks, but 2 weeks are very tough for nurses. And so I will see we must develop a special algorithm to solve those sub-problems. So what we do branch and price. We have proposed 2 decompositions. There is the classic one, which is called the roster generation, where you are just building a path or schedule for the water horizon in the sub-problem for the nurses. And we have another decomposition that we call the rotation generation that are inspired from the aircrew scheduling problems. And we have plenty of techniques. So the 2 main ones that I would show is it's the soft resource constraint shortest path. So how to handle soft constraints or inside the resource constraint shortest path. And also we have developed, I think, a meet heuristic that is new and that works pretty well too. And then we have implemented plenty of acceleration techniques that already exist in the literature. So quick recall for branch and price and column generation. So column generation, you start by a linear relaxation. So with a limited set of schedules, for example, you take the duals from the linear relaxation that you get, and with the dual, you solve the sub-problems to price the schedules that may have a negative reduced cost, and so can improve your LP solution. If you find any, you add them to the LP and you restart until you are not able to find any skills that have a negative reduced cost. As we have many nurses, so for example, 150 nurses, you don't want to solve all the sub-problems at each iteration. Classically, what you do, perhaps you solve only 20 of them. And if you find negative columns for those 20 sub-problems, you add them to the master and you restart. And you just rotate over the sub-problems that you solve until you optimality. And when you are achieve optimality here, you have to solve all the sub-problems and ensure that you are not finding any columns for any of the sub-problems. That is speed up or just to consider a subset of it at the beginning. And once you have done that, branch and price, it's just column generation at every node of your branch and bound tree. So very time consuming. So the rotation generation. So here you have a schedule over a week, and you have some sequence of working days and some sequence of resting days. The idea of the rotation is we are only looking at the sequence of work days. It's exactly the same thing that you do in aircrew scheduling. You are starting from a base where the employee leave, and you do a sequence of flights until you come back to the base. Here, the base is the rest, so you are resting at home, and so the rotation, that is the sequence of flight here, will be the sequence of days work. And so what we have in the master problem is what we call a rotation graph. And so it's how do you have a sequence of rest period and working period. So all the nodes in the top, the blue nodes represent days where you rest, and the green one represent days where you work. So for example, if we look at the previous one, which is off, 2 days of working, 2 days off, and 2 days working, you give this pass here. You start here, so you're resting at the beginning. Then you will here and you will work for 2 days. Then you rest. You rest for the second day as you go there. And here you work for 2 days. So you don't have the shift detail, you just know if you are resting or working, but you are able like that to build a sequence. And so you can put the cost of a rotation on the arc that you're using. So you can have many parallel arcs that are doing exactly the same transition, but with different cost. And then here you will have also, for each rest arc, you will have the cost of using it. What you know, if you take this one here, you are forced to work. So it means that you have rest 2 days. So for the subproblem, what you have is you have this kind of time expanding graph where for each day you represent each of the shifts and the transition that you can do between shifts. And then you just need to have a source node and a sink node, and you connect all the nodes to the source and all the nodes to the sink. So you can really start at any day in the graph and finish at any day. So it's how you build those rotations. Then the other approach is to do a roster regeneration. So instead of having just the sequence of work here, you are generating the whole sequence. Yes?
Can I ask a question about the rotation?
Yeah.
So you said you could have preferences to have days off or days on, specific days to the time horizon. You managed to capture that with the rotation?
Yes, there is no issue. So here, if you have the preferences, if you work on this one and there is a preferences to be off or on, it will be either forbidden if it's hard, or will be included inside the cost of the rotation. And for the day off, because yes, what I didn't say here is for sure you have one with rotation graph per nurses.
Yeah.
So here, same for the rest arc. If there is a rest arc and you have you go on the day where you prefer to work, the arc will be penalized and take into account the preferences. If it's an arc, you just remove the arcs that. So for example, if you don't want to work on R5, you just forbid this node and remove all the arcs, and you ensure. And you can do exactly the same here. If you don't want to work, if you want to work on D5, you can forbid to stop on D5 to go there and force the rotation to take them. So it's just, you can just play by putting a cost or removing edges and arcs. So for the roster, you generate the whole one. So there is some advantage is you produce a way tighter relaxation. Because, for example, when you have global constraints where you count the number of work days, when you do the rotation, the constraints will be in the master problem. And for each rotation that you take, you will add the number of work days that comes with it. But as you are solving an LP, you can cheat on those numbers. But when you build there, here you work 4. And so if it's not enough or if it's too much, you're going to pay the penalty for it. So you are not able to cheat on those numbers anymore. So for sure, the relaxation is tighter. At the same time, there is a disadvantage because you must produce paths over the whole horizon. So it means that you have a longer path, and so the subproblems are way tougher to solve. So you take the same graph than before, you add the rest nodes now because you consider them into the subproblems, and you have one source and one sink as before. But the difference here is that the source is only connected to the first day and the sink only to the last day. So you really have to go through the whole network to be able to have and produce a roster. So as you can see, the path that you will produce are way longer than the one that you produce for the rotations. And so it takes way more time. So let's look at how we can model some of the different things inside those graphs. So for example, modeling min-max constraints. So you have a resource by type of sheet you track. So for example, rest, work, early, and you look at those ones. You generally have a lower and upper bound associated to those type of constraints. And if it's soft, you have the cost of violating the constraint, but per unit generally. It's just, so for example, if the lower bound was 5 and you do only 3, you're going to pay twice the penalty. And then, so for example, here, if you are looking at the number of work shifts, I've illustrated here 3 paths. So if you look at the first one here, the first shift is rest, the second is late. So you have worked only 1, so the value would be 1. The 2 other have worked 2 days, so you have value 2. But you can look also at some other things. So for example, number of consecutive late shifts. So here, the first one, you have only 1. Same for the second one, you have only 1. And the third one, you have 2. And so you can track and count things like that. What will happen here is, for example, from the late you go to night or you go to early, you're going to reset those counters to 0. And if you are not within the bound, you're going to pay the penalties that comes with it. And so that's the way you can track all those different constraints and min-max. The other one is for patterns. So you can have different patterns. So generally a pattern is represented by a sequence of top couple. So the couple is the day and the shift. So this one can be generic representation. So a day can represent a set of day and a shift can represent a set of shift. So for example, let's say that we want to forbid the pattern, no Friday night if you rest on the weekend. So you will have this pattern. So Friday night, any day, so it will be Saturday rest, Sunday rest. So if you find this pattern, you're gonna put a cost on it or even forbid this pattern. And so you need to track those patterns and follow them. Some other, as I told, we can avoid those transition early, late, early. So the pattern would be any day early, any day late, any day early. And so if we look for this one here, what we track in the partial pass is your position in the pattern. So if you're at 0, it means that you didn't start the pattern and you don't care. But as soon as you're bigger than 0, it gives you the position where you are in the pattern. So for example, here, this only one that has started the pattern is the green one, where you have the early late. So you have done the 2 first of the pattern. So what we start is saying that you are in position 2. And so then if you go too late, and we're just gonna reset the pattern, and so you get 0 because the pattern is broken, so it's finished. But if you go too early, you will increase the pattern to 3, and you're gonna either forbid this transition or you're gonna pay the cost associated to the violation of the pattern. So let's look now at soft resource constraint shortest path. How do we model those soft constraints? Here, you have a partial path, and you arrive here, and you have 2 partial paths. Yes, says that the first, let's say you have only one resource, which is the consecutive work days, and you have a lower bound of 3, and upper bound of 5, and a penalty of 30. So you want to be between 3 and 5, and you pay 1 for each working days missing or exceeding those bounds. And here you have 2 partial paths, so you have -100, -200, so that you perhaps to other constraint that you have violated and the dual cost of the partial path. And here what you have is 2 resources. The first one has already worked 3 days and the second one has worked only 1 day. So with classical domination, there is nothing you can do here because this one in terms of cost is better than this one. But the problem is here on the resource. This one is below the lower bound, and this one is above the lower bound. So you cannot say anything here between those if you do, because if the constraints were hard, if you stop working here, you are infeasible. And so the way the resources of this algorithm has been developed, it's mainly for hard constraints. So here, because you are below the lower bound, you could be infeasible, and so there is no domination, nothing that happened here. But it's not our case. We are not hard, we are soft. And so the idea here is to look at the worst case analysis. So there is 2 possibilities. Here in the worst case, you stop work immediately here. So what happens if you stop? The partial path of the first one, as you are above the lower bound, remain -100. And the second one, you are missing 2 to get the lower bound. So you had 60 and you are -140. The second possibility is you work 4 days, so to reach the upper bound for the second one. And so here, what will happen is you are still below the upper bound for the second one, so the cost doesn't change, but you're gonna pay 2 penalty for the cost of the first one. And so what you see here is that in both cases, the partial path 2 is better than the partial path 1 in terms of cost. So what we want is to dominate here and saying that we just want to keep partial path 2 because partial path 2 will always be better than partial path 1. So how we do that morphology? So the idea is for each resource, you just look at the difference between the values. So for example, in our case was 2. And so the worst case is the penalty times this difference, generally. So you get those penalty, and then what you do is you look at the cost of partial ones. Cost 1, you take the worst case for the partial path 1, you add that for all the resources, And if you are still below the cost of partial pass 2, so if you want to take the best case for partial pass 2, so you're not going to pay any penalty for any resource. And if you are still in this worst case better, you can dominate. And same in the reverse way, you look at the cost 2, you add all the worst case, and if you are still better, you can dominate. But if you don't have that, you can just do, nothing can be saved. And so that helps us to really dominate way more and to remove many, many partial paths and to be way more efficient, as you will see in the results. You could try to do something that are more efficient than that, because you have generally resources that increase in the same way. So taking the lower bound on one side in terms of worst cost and taking the upper bound on the other side will perhaps never happen. But if you do that, computing those worst case will start to be way more complex in terms of computation, and it cannot be done independently for each resources. So I think in terms of implementation, it's way more expensive. And as those parts where you dominate in this algorithm, it's really the bottleneck of the algorithm. You want some code to be very efficient. So you lose a little perhaps in terms of domination you can do, but will be way more faster to be able to compute those things independently. And you can do even better than that. You can do some pre-processing and to be able really just to compute the worst case for each partial pass and compare them directly. So this kind of thing can be implemented very efficiently. So once we have done that, we have also added many other acceleration techniques for the subproblems. So all those ones are known acceleration techniques. So the first one is decremental state space relaxation. The idea here is you will relax some of the bounds of some of the constraints that you have on the path. So for example, you will release the lower bound and just use the upper bound and see what you get. Even you can remove some resources and try to solve the subproblem without some of those resources. So you do that just for the domination. So it means that all the paths that you're producing are still feasible with the right cost and so on, because you take all the resources and all the bounds when you expand the partial path, but for the domination, you lose only a subset. It allows you to dominate way more and to do that faster also. So you are producing way more partial paths, and so you're faster in the resolution. So that has been used a lot. It's a heuristic, but there is some speed directly associated to it. Bidirectional algorithm. So the idea is you start from the thing until the middle. You start from the source until the middle, and then you go backward. And once you arrive at the middle, you merge. The idea is if you take the worst case, is the number of partial paths that you have, it's 2 at the power of the day. So you can do the math, but doing bidirectional, you're producing way less levels than doing just a full way. That has been done a lot in vehicle routing too, when you are building routes in current generation. So you even have some theoretical proof that it's faster to do that. The other one that we tried is the idea is at any point, you just want to look what is the shortest path if you forget the resources, just in terms of cost to go to the sink. And then you can just say, oh, does there any chance that I can go here to the sink with a negative reduced cost? If it's not the case, you just remove. There is also what we call truncating labeling. So it means that, for example, you will expand only 10 partial paths at each node. And so that's heuristics, but that could be used to try to find some solution faster at the beginning. There is also enumerating small paths. So the idea is you have a constraint with a small lower bound and small upper bounds. For example, I don't know, 1 and 3. Instead of tracking these constraints, you're just gonna enumerate all the possibilities. And so you create arcs, but you remove a constraint. So sometimes it can speed up things. And some others. So for the master problems, there is a S here that should be removed. So many techniques too. So we have implemented strong branching. So here we don't do column generation in the strong branching. We are just forcing the branching decision and computing the resulting LP. And we choose the best node based on that. Diving. So the idea of diving, it's a classical one also, is you fix some columns to 1. So some roster or some rotation, and then you regenerate until you reach integrality. So it's a good way to produce integer solution. The other thing is, in terms of the exploration, we always dive. So it means that you always, in the branching bound tree, go until you reach a leaf that you fathom and you backtrack. The reason is, in column generation, it's very fast to re-optimize every time you dive. But backtracking and going to other nodes, it's really not way more expensive. So you want to take advantage of that. We try to implement dual stabilization. So in generally in column generation, the dual values varies a lot. And that as you use them to price the subproblems, you don't want those variations. You want them to be as close as possible to the optimal solution that you will get at the end. And so you can try to stabilize them, to put some bugs and try to control the variation of those dual. But it's very tough to tune those type of techniques. So we try to implement them, but we did not really succeed in any major improvement with it. For sure, we use the Lagrangian lower bound to prune. So it's just a way to compute a lower bound based on when you solve the subproblems to optimality, you can compute a bound with it. And also what I will present, we have built a heuristic based on the MIP problem to create more integer solution faster. So let's talk about the MIP heuristic. So the idea is we will take advantage of the two decomposition that we have for the MIP. So when you build those, you solve the roster decomposition because it's the best one. It's the one that we will use now. And you take the relaxation, you have plenty of rosters like that. The problem is what you do generally, you solve column generation at the root node, and then very often you take all those columns that you are generating and you solve a MIP with it, hoping that you will get a good solution. The issue here is that you don't have much flexibility. If you have you don't have a good coverage with the rosters that you have generated, you will be forced to select rosters that has a very high cost, or you will be forced to do some under coverage and pay some penalty also because of that. And so the idea here is we want to use the rotation decomposition that allows you way more flexibility because you can recompose in the master this sequence. We are only generating the rotation. And so, for example, here we have rotation 1 and rotation 2, but if you have another schedule with rotation 3 and 4, you can generate many schedules with those 4 rotation instead of only 2 that you had originally. So this gain of flexibility will also help you to, I would say, increase the size of the search space that you have inside the MIP. And so we hope, and we are able to produce way better integer solution by doing so. For example, I think it's the ENRC. In ENRC, the coverage is a hard constraint. So for example, if you have a demand of 1, you want exactly 1, not 0, not 2, and you cannot have any penalty associated to. So if you do those one, generally, when you solve the MIP, you don't get any feasible solution. But with the rotation, normally you have enough flexibility to be able to get a good solution. So the idea is you take the LP solution you have with all the rotation and all the rosters, and you cut the roster into rotation. So you get a big set of rotation. You add them all in the MIP and you solve the MIP and you get an integer solution. What's nice, it can be done in parallel. So here it's totally outside of the branch and price. So at any time, you look at the LP solution that you have in the branch and pi, any node, and you can solve the MIP this way. So what we do is we run this scheme in parallel and forever. So you start, you take the LP solution, you cut it into rotation, you solve the MIP. As soon as you have a good integer solution, you solve the MIP, you give the integer solution to the branch and price, and you get back to the current LP solution and you restart the process. And you could do that in parallel during the whole branch and price algorithm. It's what we do, and it helps you to generate good integer solution. So for the experiments, we run just the roster decomposition in parallel over 8 threads. We use the open source code that is released, runs on Coinora and so BCP is a framework which is called branch cut and price that helps you to do a column generation, branch cut and price. But At the time when we use it, it was a little maintained, but it has not been maintained since a while. So if we have to redo our code, I'm pretty sure we will remove that part from our code and perhaps code it ourselves. But now we are stuck with it because honestly, that's not very easy to use. And CLP, which is the LP solver of CoinOware. And the MIP heuristic use GERAD, but it can also be used with CBC. We use the interface of CoinOware that helps you to switch from GERAD to CBC or even Cplex without any effort, just a parameter. And so for the experiments, we have some feature analysis on several instances of the different things and acceleration techniques that we presented, and a lot of results on all those benchmarks. So first, here what we have done, we have just looked at all the, and I will present them, all the different acceleration techniques that we talk about even more, and we do that with the basic dominance rule without the soft, where we are just looking at bounds without taking into account the cost. As you can see from many of those instances, so that's the solving time for them to optimality. You have crazy numbers. So here, I don't know how many hours it's, but 8 or 9 hours at least. I think even more. No, 8 hours. And then you can see the different improvements. So here, let's look at the major ones. So this one, RCRP, is the shortest path to the sink. So the reverse shortest path. So works pretty well. Here you can see you can cut a lot and so decrease the in average the computational time by 2. Bidirectional also works pretty well. DSSR also works, so it's the decremented state space registration. And this one is truncated labeling with a value of 10, and here we have mix also. So you can really see that, and the enumeration doesn't work at all. So really here is those 3 techniques that were known in the literature work really well. But when you go to soft domination, so the first thing is you can see that when we use the intro dominance rule with the soft constraints, the resolution time decreased by 20, 25 in some instances. And you're really able to solve these instances. Here it's what, in 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 13 minutes, when we were needed hours before. So that's the first good message. The second one is, as you can see, most of the acceleration techniques doesn't work anymore. I think you are doing such a good job with the new domination rules that this one that helps you to manage and remove most of the big numbers labels that you have for partial pass are not needed anymore. The only one that remains good is bidirectional, and what you can see, it's on those instances that are a little bigger because you're on an 8-week horizon instead of 4, works well. On the 4 weeks, you have even decreased sometimes of the result, the speed ups. And the other one that are here that correspond to ENRC instances, you have some hard constraint in it, not just soft constraint. And I think that's the reason why also the bidirectional works well, and you have good improvements with it on those ones. And because of the hard constraints, you have way more partial path. So if we look at the acceleration techniques, but for the master problem, so we compare the diving, the rotation heuristic, and the strong brushing, and we look at the effect in terms of the lower bound and the upper bound over a time limit of 2 hours on some instances also. So what you can see is for sure you have an improvement of the lower bound when you use strong branching, and nearly nothing happened for both. So as you can see, the rotation is run in parallel and it helps just for the upper bound. So you can see there is no impact on the lower bound, and the diving decrease a little the lower bound because the diving is done inside the branch and price. It's not done in parallel. And so the time you spend diving to find an integer solution is sometimes that you don't spend trying to explore some other nodes and to improve the lower bound. That's why you have a small decrease here. And if you look at the other side in terms of upper bound, you can use a huge increase in terms of the quality of the upper bound that you get with those heuristic. And strong branching, you have a small decrease. It's the same idea. Strong branching, you spend more time selecting the bound, the nodes that you will explore to increase the lower bound. But as a result, in 2 hours, you will also explore less nodes. And so you have less chance to find a good solution. And also, you don't have any techniques here to reach an integer solution quickly. So that's the main reason why you have also decrease on the upper bound. So let's look now at the benchmark. So for the international rostering competition in the literature, most of the instances were solved to optimality already. So the only thing that we have shown is we were able to do the same very quickly. So everything that is bold is optimal. As you can see, there is bold nearly everywhere except I think 3 instances that were not solved to optimality in the literature also. And the other thing that we have done is we have been able to close many instances that were still open in the literature, especially on the hidden one. So if you want for the instances, the sprint one are just with 10 employees, the median with 30 employees, and the long with 50 employees. They are all over 4 weeks. And early, late, and hidden, it's just at which stage of the competition the instances has been released. So early was for developing the algorithm. Late, I think it was just for selecting the finalists, and hidden was the one on which the finalists were ranked for the final results. And you can see here that really we closed 7 of them, and we improved the development for 9 of them. And here we closed 1 and improved for 1. So it's the underline. So we are there's still 3 open instances. And they have some very specific things. And I would say, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think one of them, in fact, is not personalized at all. They just remove all the things about all the preferences. So all the nerves are the same. So I'm pretty sure you should just tackle that as not a personalized shift scheduling problem, and you will be able to solve them also. So for NRC2, there were not much results in the literature. So we've been able to close all the 4-week instances, as you can see, in a very decent amount of time. Even the biggest ones, so for example, this one is solved in 70 seconds, and you have still 120 nurses over 4 weeks. So it's still a pretty big problem, but we're able to solve it very, very quickly. What you have here also, it's which technique has found the best, the optimal integer solution. So H is for the MIP heuristic, B is for the branch and bound, so just in the exploration of the tree, and D is for diving. So as you can see, in the 4 weeks, you have a little of every indices that appear, but it's really in 8 weeks where you can see that the heuristic has found the best integer solution most of the time. I think the reason behind here is you can see that most of the solutions that were solved to optimality, the best solution generally is not obtained with the heuristic. So I think the heuristic perhaps has difficulty to find the optimal solution that helps you to get good solution pretty fast. And that's why all those ones are found with nearly most of the time with the heuristic. So we have been still able to close 5 of them. And the solving time that we're using here, it's 1 hour per week. So 4 hours at the time limit. And here where you don't see that, where you see a dash, it means that we reached the time limit that was set to 8 hours. I would try to run them for 1 day, and we were able to close some other instances by running out there. And then the last one, it's the NRP. So here it's honestly, it's a weird data set. We just solved them because there were several papers trying to solve this benchmark, so we think it was worth trying it. So where it's weird is, as you can see here on the number of weeks, you have several instances that are nearly half of them that are less than 4 weeks, but then the number of weeks increase until 52 weeks for the biggest one. What is weird for me, I don't see any motivation to solve an instance over 52 weeks, especially if you have preferences. Really, do you have any employee that are able to give you any preferences in 6 months? I'm not even sure. Even the one here, it's 6 months. I don't think it makes any sense. But for sure, it produces very tough instances that are very tough to solve. So as you can see here, so on this one, it's same idea, 1 hour per week. So here we use 52 hours, and 52 hours, we have no solution. Nothing, no lower bound, no solution. What happened is every iteration takes a very, very long time. So perhaps there is heuristic that could be developed rolling around, solving just bit by bit and putting them together and so on. But honestly, I don't see the interest of doing so, because I don't see the interest of solving instances so big. And so for the other, we're still able to get some results. So where you don't see a lower bound, it's because for the column generation, we use only heuristic techniques and we never went to optimality because we're not able to. And so that's why we only have an upper bound. And so we have been able to find new upper bounds, so 3 of them, 2 new lower bound, and we were able to close one instance here, the instance 19. And so here you have the results in the literature. So most of them were already closed, and I think the result that you get for that will just put the model in GERAD and run it over many threads and for a very long time. So the take-home message about everything that we talked about for the moment is really the self-domination has sped up the resolution times about 25 times for 8-week roster. So really I would say change everything. With classical domination, using the roster approach for those horizons doesn't work at all, and you're not able to do anything. But here you really change the game. The MIP heuristic produces good integer solution, and I'm pretty sure it's something that could be reused in some other branch and price approach. And so as the roster approach is really now manageable in terms of computation time, you are able to produce way better bands also with that than the rotation approach that we used before, and we prove optimality from many of them. So as I told you, it's we have just this paper that has been accepted. So for the moment, it's still not published, so you won't be able to reach them. But fortunately, you have a cahier of GERAD of the same paper, so you can have it here. And also here, it's the open source code for the scheduler, where you can find our code if you want to use it. And I will show you here where we also develop an interface. So some student of Polytechnique as an interface to play with the, I would say, in a more friendly manner with the solver. So I'm just gonna take a few minutes to show you the interface. So the interface is like that. So here in orange, you have the history. Here you have the work schedule that you have. So only 5 weeks, or 2 weeks and 5 nurses. And you can play with it. So for example, here I can say, oh, I like this late day, so I want to keep it. Oh, I don't like this one, so I want to remove it, and so on. Let's say, for example, this one. And then you can just regenerate. So as is, so you just take that. And if you could change also some of the constraint, the demand, and some other things. So if you do that, up you go there, up to success, and you can see the new scheme. You can see also here it's hidden, the report. So the report gives you some idea of the cost. So here you have the cost for the demand. The solution is optimal. And then you have the cost for the consecutive constraints about rest that you created, the one about the work, the preference cost, the runtime, and the total cost. And if you want to do that, here it's the interface where you can select the nurses that you want, the planning horizon, the shift that you want, the skills. Here you can enter all the preferences that can be hard or weight. Same here for the hospital demand. You have a min max for each one, lower and upper bound, and you can put a different weight and hard or not hard if you can violate it. And same here, you have the history of the nurse that you can set. And then here, you can, for example, also here change the preference and put this one as hard, for example, for early. And you can regenerate the schedule. And so I think it was this one that we put hard in early, or no, I think it was this one. And so you can see here. So the idea it works is you can define shift and skills. So shift here, skills here. You can define groups of shift that we call shift types. So here we have one shift type by shift, but you can think that for the type early, you can have 2 types of early, 2 early shifts that have the same type. And so in the consecutive constraints, well, you are counting both the same way. So that's why you may want to have some types. If you don't define them, the solver will automatically convert each shift in its own shift type. And then you have the contract, is where you can really here define plenty of constraints. So as you can see, it's the list of all the type of constraints that we are able to handle. So the code is done in a way that I won't say easily, but you can add new constraints. It's really modular. But so here, for example, we have defined some patterns on all days, late, and here early, and we put that on hard, no, 50. So it means that if you do a late and then an early shift, you're gonna pay 50. And so then you can go back to the schedule, and here you have the history of the schedule that you have produced and the version. So every time you create a new one, you increase the number of versions from 1 to 2 and so on for this profile. And when you regenerate, you get .4, .5, and so on. So thank you very much for your attention and for the huge presence today. And if you have any question,